Uh, well, we're studying in the book of Jonah, and so how many of you know what happens in the book of Jonah? Some of you. I really feel like, okay, everybody wake up. Everybody pay attention for a minute, because I think that you weren't actually answering that question honestly. Everybody know, everybody out here that knows what the book of Jonah is about, just raise your hand. Okay, still some people that don't know. Wow, that's awesome. Okay, we'll start from the beginning then. Usually, the challenge that I have in the book of Jonah is that it's kind of hard to break it up into pieces because it's one story. And most of the time, we learned Jonah since flannel graph days. And have I explained flannel graph enough that you youngsters in the front know what it is now? Okay, so yeah, before there was video readily available to teach children from video with graphics, back when we were still using clip art on newsletters, we taught children with little, they sold like a whole pack with all the Bible stories, not all the Bible stories, just all the like important ones. All the ones you could teach children. There was no Song of Solomon in the flannel graph. I can guarantee you that. And so you had a flannel board on a tripod, and then you stuck the people on, and you told the story. And it was kind of like claymation. If we would have videoed it, we could have moved them. And okay. So Jonah is one of those flannel graph stories. We've been learning it since we were kids, if you've been in church. And that makes it a challenge to teach, because usually it's just like 4 chapters or whatever. It's one lesson in the children's group. And to break it up, it's really hard not to preach the rest of it. And it's really hard to teach Jonah and not have all the church people that have heard it 1,000 times say, oh yeah, I've heard this one, and go ahead and start scrolling Facebook or whatever you do when you've already heard a message on what I'm about to preach on. Doodle on we used to have bulletins, and you doodle on them. That's what you did. And we'd find 135 bulletins doodled on the seats when we left. Nobody actually took them for announcements. They just used them as something to color on while they were supposed to be listening. I'm a little cynical, aren't I? I'm sorry. That's my spiritual gift. Jonah is an interesting book. It's in the Minor Prophets. We're studying the Minor Prophets in our live Bible studies on Sunday morning right now. And so it is one of the few books that it seems like the word of the Lord came to Jonah, son of Amittai. But usually in the prophetic works, when you begin with the word of the Lord came to Jonah, then you go into, and this was the word of the Lord. So last week, Pastor Desiree preached on the book of Obadiah. It's 1 chapter, and it was a prophecy against the Edomites, and the whole thing was pretty much in quotes. The word of the Lord came to Obadiah, and this is what it is. But Jonah's not like that. Because in the book of Jonah, it says the word of the Lord came to Jonah, son of Amittai, and the message was like one sentence, like one verse. And the rest of the story, instead of being about what the word of the Lord was, the rest of the story is essentially more about the prophet than about the prophecy. And that makes it very different from the minor prophets that are around it. And in fact, I sometimes forget that it's one of the minor prophets because it feels more like a history book when we start to interpret it, because it's a story of something that happened. And there's been all sorts of things that have been said about when it was and what it was, and whether Jonah was a real person or whether it was more of an illustration story. I think, well, first of all, I think the really cool thing about Jonah in the midst of the minor prophets is that sometimes when the prophecy is against Edom, for instance, we can have a tendency to say, well, that was Edom and this is us. But when the story is primarily a story about the prophet, I'm really convinced that it doesn't matter that the subject of the prophecy, the person, the people that Jonah was to preach to, weren't even the people of God. They were not people of God at all. They were the Assyrians. They were the people that didn't follow God at all. They were people that in fact were going to come and take over Israel. And so if he had spent the whole time sharing the prophecy, then we might have said, well, the point of this story is all those evil people out there, we need to go prophesy to them and tell them they're going to go to hell. God's going to destroy you. But instead, we have this whole story about the person that is usually the person we ignore in the story, and that's the prophet. Well, we put ourselves in the place of the prophet usually, right? We have this tendency to read stories and we are the hero of the story. This is one of the few times when you should read this story as the hero of the story. Because you are the Jonah that it was written about. So it says this, it says, the word of the Lord came to Jonah, son of Amittai. Go to the great city of Nineveh and preach against it, because its wickedness has come up before me. That's it. Go preach against Nineveh because its wickedness has come up before me. Verse 3. But Jonah ran away from the Lord and headed for Tarshish. He went down to Joppa, where he found a ship bound for that port. After paying the fare, he went aboard and sailed for Tarshish to flee from the Lord. So if you were in Bible study with us, we had a map, I think, on the back of our Bible study, and essentially there's a place called Tarsus that wasn't very far from there, and it would have been up here, but I think a lot of scholars believe that this place Tarshish was not Tarsus, but it was actually a place that was clear in the strait that runs between modern-day Spain and Morocco, I think it is. Basically, it was the farthest you could get in that part of the world before you wandered out into the ocean. It's probably the farthest place that you could get a boat to take you. And funny enough, if you were getting in a boat, you were not going to Nineveh. Because where Nineveh is on that map is not a place that you get to by boat. Not from there, at least. So, Jonah went the exact opposite direction from where God told him to go. Now, I think all of us could tell a Jonah story in our life. I have often told people that first of all, I had no intention of coming to Albuquerque. I had no intention of leaving the Midwest. I had no intention of going into ministry. I was called to ministry at a young age. I said it out loud in front of people that went to my church, people that were leaders in my church, and nobody ever really followed up on me on it, and I was kind of like, whew. I said it out loud. Nobody said, maybe they thought, oh, this guy's crazy. This is not preacher material. Hopefully he'll forget about it. And I did. I forgot about it. And I didn't really forget about it. I ignored it. And I went to engineering school like pretty much everybody in my family does. And did the exact opposite thing. And so I've joked at times that God somehow spit me up out of the belly of the whale onto this beach called New Mexico with no water. And somehow I ended up here in a very Jonah-like story where I did not want to follow the will of God. But if I'm being honest, I wasn't really following the will of God in other areas of my life at that time either. So as a young person, I heard the word of God, but it's not like I said, oh, I'm not going to go to where you're telling me in Albuquerque, God. I'm going to go. It was really more, I want to do what I want to do. In fact, I'll tell you, so I was on the swim team in high school, and I was a pretty good swimmer. Not like outstanding, but pretty good. I worked my butt off. I worked hard. And I remember that one of the kids that swam with us all the way through middle school and up through like freshman or sophomore year, he was an outstanding backstroker. Probably could have placed in state pretty well in the backstroke. And he just decided not to join the team the next year. And we were like, man, Ryan, why aren't you joining the team? You got to join the team. This is crazy. What are you doing? And he said, no, I'm getting my life straight with God, and He's called me to ministry, so I need to cut that out of my life and focus on the priorities God has for me. And you know what my response was to that? This guy's crazy. Like, why would... This is like... First of all, does God really call that way? Does God really tell you to quit swimming? Because if that is what God calls us to do, that's not what I'm going to do, so I'm definitely not going to do that. And I was convinced that, I still kind of am a little bit, that you can pursue sports in high school and still pursue a call to ministry. I'm pretty convinced of that. But I also am, by the way, he did go into ministry, and to this day, I believe, is doing ministry. Pastored a church in Iowa for a little while and is doing a YouTube ministry right now. I just didn't understand it. And I really wasn't serving God at a level to know whether He would ask me to do that or not, or to care. So my Jonah story is, I'm not sure it's an apples to apples story. I do think it's the way we think of Jonah stories, isn't it? God was calling me, but I really wanted to do my own thing. I'm not sure that's what Jonah's story was in my life, because I was not really following God at the time that it came to make those kind of decisions in my life anyway. But I am now. And I would argue that I'm more likely to have a Jonah story in my life now that resembles Jonah's story than the story that I look back to as my Jonah story. Did you follow that? Why? Why? Because I'm the person that this story was written for. I'm now the person that this was written to. I am now the person who has previously chosen to follow God, has already chosen to do the things that God has called me to do. That's who Jonah was, as far as we can see. Jonah was not somebody who was far from God. Jonah is the person who was a prophet. He's the person who God was calling. He's the person who really, and if you might say, well, maybe he was and maybe he was, but this was do you know how many pagans or heathens read the Bible? You want to give me a ballpark percentage? I'm guessing it floats somewhere around 0. Now, unfortunately, I could say that probably about Christians too, in too many circumstances. But if God was writing Scripture, who is his expected audience? Is it the expected audience for Scripture is actually not pagans and heathens. The expected audience in most cases for most of Scripture is us who are following God. So when God included this in the Scripture, his purpose and his point was to address people who are already following God, who have already put their trust in him, but perhaps don't know what that looks like or how to continue to walk in that. And so it is encouragement and it is teaching for those who have put their faith in Jesus, and how are we going to move forward in that faith. So the story isn't for somebody who's away from God entirely. The story is for somebody who is following God, but hears something from God that they don't like. He heard the word of the Lord, and he didn't. Now, I'm not going to get into why he didn't like it, because I think that becomes more and more clear as we go through the book of Jonah, and I don't want to preach the whole book today. Is it possible that a person who is already following God can hear something from God that they don't like and say, nope? Nope. Let me say something else. Let me ask something else. Here's one thing I've noticed in the church. If you say, God is calling me, people can't argue anymore. So a lot of times, the way it works, if God is calling us, so many times I could have said, God is calling me to Hawaii to sacrifice for him. God is calling me to Florida. God is calling me to some beautiful place, some great place, or just some place that doesn't have this, whatever this is. I'll be honest. If it's been a few days since I've driven into the neighborhood where this church sits, there are days when I drive in and I'm like, really, God, this? This is what you've called me to? And I'll never forget when I first became lead pastor. That's been almost 15 years ago. When I went to fill out my first pastor's report, which happens every May, and I report for the year that we've just finished, and I logged on for the first time, and there was all these cool buttons on the website, not just the pastor's report, which was really boring and I didn't want to do, so I was poking all the other buttons of cool stuff that was on there, including this exploring missions form, which was really great. I was like, this is great. Exploring missions. This sounds great. So I filled out the exploring missions form, and I submitted it. And Cynthia and we went to this little thing over at Point Loma. They had I forget what they called it, but it was basically, do you really understand, or are you really ready for cross-cultural ministry? Because a lot of times we think we are and we don't really know what that looks like. And so they were kind of giving us the experience of what it would be like to be speaking a different language from the people that we're trying to share with, and if they don't really understand what we're saying. And it was really cool, and I came out of it like really pumped, and I was like, I'm ready to go to Africa. This is great. And I remember, so I put my DS as one of my, references. And I get a call from Dr. Huff, and he says, Pastor Pete, I just got a call from the General Church, and they said you filled out the exploring missions form. I'm like, yeah. He said, are you feeling called to missions? I said, I think so. Yeah, it's crazy. It's weird. I think so. I don't know. I think so. And he said, you know, what you're doing is missions right there, right? I was like, yeah. He's like, all right, just wanted to make sure you knew that. That was the end of the conversation. And I got a call for the next meeting, the next step. And they said, are you ready for the next step? And I said, I don't think so. I don't think. Now here's the thing. If we'd have stood up in front of the church, and this is the point of the story, if we'd have stood up in front of the church and Cynthia and I had said, God has called us to mission work in Africa, then the church would have maybe been sad, but yeah, everybody would have clapped. Everybody would be like, that's awesome. You know, God's going to use you in these mighty ways, and the church would have been affirming, because that's what we do, right? If somebody said, God's calling me to go pastor this church or that church, and it was one of our staff members, everybody would be like, yeah, you're ready for it. God's going to use you. This is going to be great. But do you know that if you stand up and say that and God didn't say it, it actually doesn't matter that everybody affirms it if that's not really what God has said. And one of the most challenging things that I've experienced in my life and ministry is how many well-meaning people kind of sometimes affirm things that sound really cool that God might do, but not really sure that was what God would. In fact, I came to believe that so far, every time I've thought about leaving and thought I could go do something really cool, really big for God, that God's will was actually for me to be here. And that really cool, really big things for God were already happening here. And He still wanted those to continue to happen here. So I just wonder when Jonah got in the boat, if there wasn't some people that were like, man, that's awesome, Jonah. God spoke to you. You're a prophet. I bet those people out in Morocco and Spain haven't heard about the message of Jesus or God. This was pre-Jesus. They haven't heard the message of the God of the Hebrews. Everybody's like, good job, Jonah, good job. Meanwhile, God was like, no good. Okay, let's keep going. Then the Lord sent a great wind on the sea, and such a violent storm arose that the ship threatened to break up. All the sailors were afraid, and each cried out to his own God, and they threw the cargo into the sea to lighten the ship. Guess what? When they loaded that cargo on there, they needed it. That's a big deal. When you start throwing cargo into the sea, you start deciding which things you need the least. But none of it you didn't need at all, because if you didn't need it at all, you would not have packed it. So you start deciding which things you need the least, because each thing you throw might also kill you, because you don't have, for instance, food and drinkable water. So it wasn't like a small thing that they started throwing cargo overboard. It was that we are definitely going to die in this storm if we don't. We'll figure out what to do with the things that we threw over that we still need later after we survive this storm. But Jonah had gone below deck, where he lay down and fell into a deep sleep. Now, here's a funny thing. When I read about that, the first thing that pops into my mind is another similar story about somebody sleeping in the bottom of a boat. You remember that story? It was Jesus. You know, and we know that Jesus was sleeping because the peace of God was upon him. That he wasn't afraid of the storm, right? And we know that even when he woke up, he's like, you guys are afraid? Like, don't you know I'm still here? It's going to be fine. And they're like, no, you were sleeping. We weren't sure you had this. But he said, peace be still, and the storm calmed. And now here's Jonah in the bottom of the boat in a very similar way with the peace of God, right? I don't think he's got the peace of God. And I think this is important. I think this is important because of the number of people that I talk to that feel like they have this peace. So God must be with them, right? I wonder how many of us are Jesus sleeping in the bottom of the boat, and how many of us are Jonah sleeping in the bottom of the boat. And sometimes I think that sometimes when we follow God, we end up with this sort of trouble, and this happens a lot. In fact, I always, especially when people are baptized, when people receive their first local minister's license, when people get a district license or ordained, when people take some big steps in their life to follow the calling of God, then what often happens is right after that, they're attacked, and they got black eyes and bloody noses, and spiritually speaking, right? And they're like, they look like they have just been pummeled. And they're like, I don't know if I'm doing the right thing. Maybe God isn't in this. And you're like, no, I think God is in this, but this is something, the enemy has not been attacking because the enemy doesn't need to attack his own. But now you've made a decision to follow God, and you're going to make an impact for God, and the enemy's angry, and he knows that this is going to be a problem, and so he goes after you. So sometimes peace doesn't mean we're right with God. Sometimes peace means the enemy's not attacking. Because he doesn't need to, because we're on his team. And I thought of that when I thought about Jesus and Jonah in the bottom of the boat. I thought, how many of us are Jonah, but we've convinced ourselves and the people around us we're Jesus? And we're using the story of Jesus sleeping in the boat or other similar stories to justify the fact that we have this peace, so we must be doing the right thing. We must be in right relationship with God, when really, here's the thing, Jonah knew, didn't he? The captain went to him and said, how can you sleep? Get up and call on your God. Maybe he will take notice of us so that we will not perish. Then the sailors said to each other, "Come, let us cast lots to find out who is responsible for this calamity." They cast lots, and the lot fell to Jonah. I wonder if at that point they knew he was the prophet. Like, I mean, you ever see, if you were in this situation, just imagine, and there's a group of us, and then there's the preacher, and you're like, let's cast lots, let's roll dice, let's draw straws to figure out who is it. You know, God's in this, and he's going to reveal himself through this chance thing. That's the way they thought about it, is nothing really is chance. God can order chance. And so God will use this thing that is obviously not influenced by us to reveal to us who's at fault. And you're all around and you're like, somebody's done something wrong here. And you're rolling the dice, and it comes to the preacher, and you're like, okay, we must have did it wrong. I mean, like, you think that that's what they thought when they heard about Jonah being a prophet of God? A Hebrew, a follower of God? We must have did it wrong. Because I think they knew the power of the Hebrew God. Now, I think that for a lot of reasons. I think, one, because throughout the Old Testament, even if we go back to Genesis and Exodus, we find out, particularly in Exodus, that the people around there feared the Hebrew God. When they show up in the promised land, when they're crossing the desert, if you read throughout the Old Testament, you find that the people in the area knew about the power of the Hebrew God. So when Israelites showed up, they were afraid of them. The story of Balaam's donkey is all about that. The Moabites were up on their mountain, just north of the Edomite mountain, right? And they were up there, and they saw Israel gathered below, and the king called on Balaam because he was afraid he was going to get attacked. Now, ironically, they were close enough relatives that God wasn't sending Israel to attack Moab, so it wasn't even going to happen. But the story is all about the Moabite king's fear of Israel because he knew about the God of the Hebrews. And so I think throughout the Old Testament, we find that as a theme, and the way they respond, it says, so they ask him, "Tell us, who is responsible for making all this trouble? What kind of work do you do? Where do you come from? What is your country?" And all of these questions, the answer to them is going to be incriminating for Jonah. "From what people are you?" He answered, "I am a Hebrew, and I worship the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land." This terrified them. It terrified them, and they asked, "What have you done?" They knew he was running away from the Lord because he had already told them. I don't know how you interpret that. Does that mean he already told them when they were asking him all those questions? Or does that mean he had already said, "I'm running away from my God," but they didn't know which God it was until he said, I'm a Hebrew, I serve the Lord of heaven and earth that created the land and the sea. And they're like, "Whoa, and you ran away from that God?" Right? Because they're all crying out to their gods haven't answered yet. They go find Jonah, call out to your God, maybe one of our gods will answer. Then they find out he serves the God that has some history of acting, of working on behalf of his people, and honestly of putting his hand against his people when they wander away from him. I mean, that was the whole dynamic between Israel and the Assyrians already. It almost feels like the people that didn't follow God had more actual belief in God than the guy who supposedly did follow God. Because they were terrified when they found out what Jonah did. Somehow he was sleeping soundly in the bottom of the boat. knowing what he did. Now, the reason I think that's really important is because I actually think that sometimes that's what I see in the world today. I know that we're church people and we look at what's going on in the world today and we're like, we got it all together and they're really messed up and they're really corrupt. They're really all kinds of, look at all the stuff they're doing, but we got it together. But when I actually talk to people, instead of like just watching the news and letting them tell me what's going on out there, when I actually talk to people, I find out that a lot of people actually, the reason they have left the church and they're not, some of them still claim to be Christians, but they don't go to church. Some of them can claim to be agnostic, believing in God, just not really sure that they define God in the same way that any kind of particular religion does. But a lot of those people, I actually think one of the reasons that they left the church is because they struggled rectifying in their minds how little the church actually seems to believe in God. And so they decided that if the church doesn't really believe in God, I don't need to be a part of it. And they decided that somehow, we say, don't forsake the gathering together, right? It's in Hebrews. We say, you gotta gather together, guys. You gotta be in church. You gotta be there. And they're like, I'm not sure that what you're doing when you gather in church is really what he was talking about. Can I just... When I go visit somebody that feels that way, I often tell them, they often think that they're telling me something surprising, first of all, which they're not. They often think that I'm going to get offended, which I don't. They often think that I'm going to defend the church, which I, by the way, don't. And I look at them most times and I say, you might be surprised that you and I agree on more than we disagree on. The only difference is I decided to deal with it from the front of the church, and you just left the church. So what I'm telling them is, sometimes I don't think a lot more of the church than you do. Sometimes I'm not sure that the people of God who call themselves the people of God, who are the church, who are attending church, sometimes I'm not sure they're really people of faith either. The difference is, I decided the best way for me to deal with that is to stand up here and challenge you to be the people of faith that God has called you to be. And they said, I don't really want to be a part of that, so they stepped out. And that's not the right response. I feel like that the response that I have taken is a more God-ordained response. I don't think that they're better for doing that. I don't think that they're good for doing that. But I do think that they have a point, because some of them actually do believe in God. And you might say, well, they're not following him though. And I would say, yeah, but they have less information about the workings of God than we do. And I notice that sometimes you don't follow him either. And I'm actually way more concerned when the people of God hear from God and don't follow him than I am when people step away, and their primary reason or excuse for stepping away is because the people of God don't follow God. I'm kind of like, yeah, we should really fix that so we wouldn't chase you away. And then I come back here because I think like on Wednesday we studied in 1 Peter where it says it's time for judgment to begin with the church. And Paul says, should we not judge those inside the church? Why are we judging those outside the church? So like I look at that and I say, hey, this is where we start. And here's the question. Not have I been Jonah back before I followed the Lord. Not are other people walking away from the Lord who are not even believers in the Lord. But am I as a person that claims to follow God, acting as if he's not as real as I say I think he is. Pastor Mike's here, not here. Maybe it's not fair that I share his story, or you can go tell him, though. It's all right. But he's been pretty open about it on Sunday mornings, and that he watched during COVID, like he was struggling and wrestling with his faith. By the way, he was already a district licensed pastor at that time. He was struggling, wrestling with his faith, and he watched a video about heaven and about this testimony, and he thought, if this is real, I better get my stuff together. That was kind of his response to it. Like, if God is real, then what does God think about what I did there? What does God think about what I said there? If God is real, and I think that's a crazy thing for a pastor to be saying. But he's been really open about it. And when I'll never forget when he came and sat at my table and he said, hey, Pastor, God's been speaking to me and this is what he said. And I thought, if he's real, and I'm like, yeah. Like, forgive my language, but holy crap. Like, dude. But I actually think that the real problem is that what Pastor Mike is admitting and testifying to is actually the same struggle that most of us have gone through. And if we looked and said, if God is real, if it's not just a matter of whether the people at church know whether I followed God, if it's not just a matter about, I mean, like maybe I did something, everybody stood up and clapped and said, woo, we're glad God's calling you, but I know that I'm actually going the opposite way that God called me. And maybe the fact that the church stood up and clapped actually doesn't matter. And maybe the fact that the people next to me in church don't have a clue that I just turned away from God and walked the other direction. Maybe that they don't know doesn't matter, because if God is real, I'm about to encounter a storm. And it's not going to be the Jesus kind of storm that I can stand up and calm, because I'm not going to be right with the Father. It's going to be the kind of storm that is only calmed when I'm thrown overboard. When somehow I sacrifice the direction that I wanted to go in favor of allowing God to actually, in this case, literally pick me up and take me the direction that He wants to go. The sea was getting rougher and rougher, so they asked him, what should we do to you to make the sea calm down for us? I think, what was it supposed to be? 30 lashes? What did they think it was going to be? What should we do to you? Slap you in the face? Make sure God knows you've been punished? He says, pick me up and throw me into the sea, and it will become calm. I know that it is my fault that this great storm has come upon you. Instead, now, I know this sounds like another going against the will of God, but when you hear what they said, when they finally decide to do it, you realize they're respecting God and fearing God, and they're a little worried that even that is going to be trouble for them. Instead, the men did their best to row back to land, but they could not, for the sea grew even wilder than before. Then they cried out to the Lord, please, Lord, do not let us die for taking this man's life. Do not hold us accountable for killing an innocent man, for you, Lord, have done as you please. In other words, you did this. And we're convinced at this point that this is the only answer, so it must be your will. But we don't think you like us killing people, so we're really confused about what to do, but just don't hold us accountable for this. Then they took Jonah and threw him overboard, and the raging sea grew calm. At this, the men greatly feared the Lord, and they offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made vows to him. I want to point this out. God showed himself true. And because God showed himself true, people trusted in God. And yes, it happened surrounding the fact that Jonah went the wrong way. That doesn't make it okay. God can show himself true no matter what the situation is. And I think God would have loved to show himself true through Jonah's obedience. But I can just tell you, God will show himself true in your disobedience too. It just doesn't go as well for you in that scenario. God is true, and he will act, and he will make others see that he is real, even when you haven't seen that he's real. Even when you are acting like he must not be real, like really real, like seeing what I'm doing, like able to act and interact based on what I'm doing. I can assure you he sees it. I can assure you he knows. And the real question is, do you believe that he knows what you do, so that when he calls you to do something, you better respond, because he knows if you didn't. He's got a good plan for you. And he's got a good plan for those around you. You got to trust him. You've got to believe that he's real, because I'm convinced that the reason the church is not exploding with people of God, with believers in God, is because the church does not act like God is real. Because the church acts like it's a trivial thing to go in the opposite direction of where God is calling. Don't let that be you. Will you pray with me? God, we are so grateful, because even if this stings, we believe it's from you and it's your grace, because you haven't given up on us yet. Because you're calling us to respond to you. Because you're calling us to take seriously your truth, that you are really who you say you are. That you have the ability to prosper us, and that's your will. But you have also the ability to send storms and let things happen in our lives because we didn't follow you. Always in hopes that we'll turn around. Always in hopes that we'll see, like the people sometimes around us see better than us, that you are real. You are worthy of trust and obedience. Lord, help us to obey you. Help us to trust that you have good in mind for us and for those around us. Forgive us, because all of us can point to a time when we haven't obeyed, we haven't followed you. But Lord, if that's been the pattern of our life, we want this to be a turning point. Lord, help us to trust you today. We praise you in Jesus' name. Amen.